I'd say if UFOs were aliens, then the key things you're trying to explain in a hypothesis is, well, we don't see much of anything in the sky. So how is it that there could be aliens both near us somewhere in space-time and that they would have come here, yet we see almost nothing out there in the universe in terms of evidence of their activity? That's a key thing you'd have to explain. But the puzzling part of UFO observations is that supposedly they are at the edge of our observation. They are not completely invisible nor completely visible. They're hanging out at the edge of visibility. So that's kind of weird. Why do that? And then why be here now yet be nowhere else we can see in the sky? But if aliens are not here now, it's, I would estimate 1 billion years before we'll see them. So if we manage to produce brain emulations before civilization declines, we probably also would manage to make Cryonics work by then. I say give you roughly 50-50. I'm not so sure which happens first, AI or brain emulations, but my guess is that neither of them happen before civilization declines, so that we have to wait until a new civilization rises again to do those things. I'd say the key thing that's happened in the last few centuries is we went from a world of hundreds of thousands of diverse peasant cultures, each of which was pretty well adapted because it was near the edge of survival in terms of famine and war and disease. And over the last centuries, what we did is we crushed peasant cultures into national cultures, and then we merged national cultures into a global monoculture, and we've greatly reduced the selection pressures on these cultures. That is, they just die off much less due to famine and disease and war. So with AI, clearly there is a status contest going on to be at the frontier of AI. A lot of tech companies feel that a matter of pride's on the line, that they should put a lot of money in to try to be at least keeping up with everybody else in AI. So clearly among tech companies, AI is a mark of status. And that may be why we're sort of over-investing in AI now, because even though there's promising, we're putting enormous amounts of money in it. And my guess is that won't actually pan out. Evolution created our tendency to care about status, to care about signaling, and to be unaware of it. Its bet was that we were better off being hypocritical and ignorant of these things than being consciously aware. So you are probably better off not knowing explicitly about signaling and status because you were designed not to know.
Welcome to the Expanding Horizons podcast. Today I am talking with Professor Robin Hanson. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University and a former research associate at the Future of Humanity Institute of Oxford University. Received a BS in physics from the University of California in 1981, an MS in physics, and an MA in conceptual foundations of science from the University of Chicago in 1984, and a PhD in social science from Caltech in 1997. He has written 2 books, one, The Age of M, which is his views on brain emulation and its eventual impact on society. His second book, The Elephant in the Brain, is about hidden motives behind our actions, and it looks at mental blind spots of societies and individuals. He's a remarkable thinker and is known for pioneering innovative concepts and explanations. He's also the mind behind fascinating ideas like prediction markets, which could revolutionize how we make decisions as societies. He has also written about Grabby aliens and the Great Filter Hypothesis, a unique perspective on why we haven't encountered aliens yet. He also blogs at overcomingbias.com, which is a personal blog on the general theme of how to move our beliefs closer to reality. Today, we'll explore these ideas and their implications. But before we dive in, I recommend reading a bit about his ideas and his work, his views on aliens, prediction markets, biases, culture drift, cryonics, and others to have a better understanding of this conversation. These can be accessed via the links in the description box. Alternatively, you could use an LLM to add more context, providing it a transcription of this video and asking it to explain concepts you haven't heard of. Thank you for listening, and get ready for a conversation that will challenge your views and expand your understanding of who we are and where we are headed. Thank you so much, Professor Robin, for joining me on this episode. I want to start off by first talking about aliens. You've written a lot about aliens, and you have proposed some explanation to the Fermi paradox, and you've written about your Grabby model of aliens. So recently there have been UFO sightings, and the US government has taken aliens a little bit more seriously. So how does these UFO sightings and these recent news headlines fit into your model or your explanations?
Well, first, I did this work a few years ago on Grabby aliens, which is an extension of my previous work on the Great Filter from 20 years before. And the question there is about the distribution of aliens as advanced as us or more advanced in the universe, i.e. the distribution in space-time. How far away are they? Where are they? And so more recently, I and some colleagues put together a 3-parameter model of where they could be in space-time, where we can fit each of the parameters to data that we have so that we can say that we have sort of a data-justified model of where they are in space-time. So the idea is aliens appear at some place in space and at a point in time, and then they start expanding from there when they're really advanced at some speed until they meet each other, and then the universe gets filled up with advanced alien civilizations. The 3 parameters are, first, how fast they expand. They could expand slowly or quickly. Secondly, there's a 2-parameter model of when they appear in time. So they appear randomly in space, but in time they appear randomly according to a power law. And so the power law has 2 parameters, a constant and a power. And we can get the constant from our current date because we are a random sample from when civilizations like us appear in time. And then the power comes from the history of life on Earth. The power, because there is a hard steps model of advanced life appearing, it has to go through a number of steps. And our current date in the history of life on Earth gives us an estimate of roughly how many hard steps there were. So we have a 3-parameter model that we fit to data. And when we do that, the rough estimate is that we will meet aliens in maybe 1 billion years or so, and that they're expanding at a large fraction of the speed of light. And so there's no immediate emergency. So that's our baseline model of aliens. And then because I guess I decided I was a world expert in where aliens are in space-time, I thought I should engage the discussion about UFOs. So in that context, obviously, the most interesting hypothesis for UFOs is they are in fact some kind of alien. And so then the question is, in the context of this model I outlined, what would be the most plausible scenario by which UFOs could be aliens? So I felt like I was an expert in constructing such a scenario, but I'm not an expert in looking at the actual evidence and deciding how much to believe it. So that's, in a Bayesian analysis, that would be the likelihood function, is how likely is each observation to be accounted for by each theory. I am an expert in the prior, i.e., what plausibly should we think is the range of believable hypotheses about this sort of scenario. So in that context, the question is, well, what fundamentally are you trying to explain? I'd say if UFOs were aliens, then the key things you're trying to explain in a hypothesis is, well, we don't see much of anything in the sky. So how is it that there could be aliens both near us, somewhere in space-time, and that they would have come here, yet we see almost nothing out there in the universe in terms of evidence of their activity? That's a key thing you'd have to explain. And the secondly, you'd have to explain why, if they are here and they are somewhat visible, that they happen to be in between the 2 obvious stories. So one story would be they just make themselves completely visible. They say hi, and they make sure we're really clear that they're here. The other option would be that they make sure they're completely invisible, which would be not obviously within their powers, and that we never see them. But the puzzling part of UFO observations is that supposedly they are at the edge of our observation. They are not completely invisible nor completely visible. They're hanging out at the edge of visibility. So that's kind of weird. Why do that? And then why be here now, yet be nowhere else we can see in the sky? So those are the things you're trying to explain if you're trying to construct a theory of how UFOs as aliens could make sense. So in the context of my Grabby aliens model, the first element I modify to try to make sense of this is to add panspermia. So The simplest model is that life appears somewhere and then expands. A more complicated but not crazy model is that life appears somewhere, grows there, and then spreads to elsewhere. And then it grows there again, and then we are in elsewhere. Life on Earth did not start on Earth. Life on Earth started somewhere else and then spread to Earth. And the most plausible way it would do that is to spread to the stellar nursery where our star was born, because in that nursery, maybe 10,000 other stars were born in the same space and time. So life had spread to us, it would spread to all those other stars as well. And so 1,000 or 10,000 stars would have spread out through the galaxy, each of which was seeded with life. And then one of those other stars could have reached an advanced level before us, and then they would be our panspermia siblings. And then they could be the alien behind UFOs because, and most plausibly, they would be tens and hundreds of millions of years more advanced than us. They certainly wouldn't be 1,000 or 10,000. That would be crazy coincidence. So one assumption, panspermia siblings, life didn't start here. Some other planet was seeded. So the key thing this does is it produces us and them nearby, but not lots of advanced life in the rest of the nearby million galaxies. It's just us and them, because you have to explain why everything seems so empty. And then in addition, you'll have to assume that they arrived 10 or 100 million years before us, and they chose not to go wild expanding in the galaxy because 1 million years would have been plenty of time for them to take over and remake the galaxy. So it was obviously different. So they didn't do that. So we have to presume they chose not to do that. For some reason, environmentalism, religion, whatever, they decided that they were not going to go conquer the galaxy and the universe. They were going to stay home and be happy there. And that's the second assumption I need. They made this decision to not expand. So again, panspermia siblings, 1, 2, the decision not to expand. But once you have that second assumption, now we know why they're here. They would know that their panspermia siblings would risk their breaking their rule against expansion. They might not expand, but their siblings could. So they would need, in order to prevent expansion, not only to lock down home, they would need to go out, find their siblings, and make sure they don't expand. So then that's why aliens would be here, to prevent us from expanding. Furthermore, we can already infer that they had a simple solution, which is just to destroy us, which would have, they would have been quite up to the task and would have been very adequate at preventing us from expanding. So clearly they didn't do that. So we can infer they have some sense of camaraderie or, family allegiance or something to us. They don't want to just destroy us. So I guess we can conclude they'd like to persuade us rather than force us to follow their rule. And then we have the last puzzle, which is, why are they at the edge of visibility rather than obvious or completely invisible? And for that, I think we can say that they needed a simple plan from home. So again, they've got this rule against expansion. They're going to send out an expedition here, and that expedition risks their whole rule. If that expedition goes rogue, it's all over. So they need this expedition to be tightly controlled, and they can't give it that much discretion. So they need to approve a policy from home that they can say, yes, do that, send out only the resources necessary to implement that policy, and then try it. Of course, if it fails, I'm sure they'll have a fallback button where they just destroy us, but they'll have some strategy from home. So then the question is, what robust strategy could they have picked from home that, without knowing much about us, they could have said that has a good chance of working, and then only sent the resources here necessary to implement that? And so my theory there is domestication. We, social animals on Earth have long, had a status hierarchies, and we have domesticated other animals via slotting into the top of their status hierarchy. That's how we domesticate horses and cows and dogs and ourselves, by sort of being nearby, being more impressive, being not too destructive, and sitting in the top of their status hierarchy. So then the theory is that's their plan for here. All they have to do is show up, be visible enough to be impressive, not be too destructive, and wait for us to get it. And then that explains why they aren't, invisible. Invisible wouldn't work. If you ask, well, why aren't they completely visible? You'd say, well, look, there's this risk that if we see something about them we hate, it won't work. They can't domesticate us. Because even humans on Earth, we have not wanted to domesticate other humans when they differ by their religion or customs or things like that. So they would know that if they reveal too much about themselves, they risk destroying this domestication effect they hope for, because maybe they eat babies and we somehow think that's bad. And so, we would be bothered by that, but they don't know which of their things are going to bother us, especially from home. So the simple strategy is don't show very much. Just hang out the edge of visibility, make sure you're impressive and peaceful and local, and just wait till they get it. So that would be the simple theory by which I could account for UFOs as aliens. And if I add all that up, I think I have to give a prior to it of maybe 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, which is not enough to say that, I would have predicted it, but it's enough to say you got to look at the evidence. So in a typical murder trial, the prior is roughly 1 in a million. 1 in 1,000 people, deaths or murder, and 1 in 1,000 of their associates would plausibly have been somebody who did it. That is, they have roughly 1,000 associates. So, but we still allow murder trials to go forward because evidence is typically capable of overcoming a 1 in a million prior. And so we listen to the accusations in a murder trial. Similarly, I say you should listen to the accusations here about UFOs because it's not crazy unlikely. And if they are in fact aliens, this is my best guess for what they're doing here, what their agenda is, and why they look like they do.
And so from a probability chance perspective, do you think it's more likely that they have visited us in the past or they visited us right now, or it's more likely they'll visit us in the future, like based on what you've seen? What the evidence?
According to this theory, again, they would be tens or hundreds of millions of years more advanced than us. They can easily see us in the sky. That is, it's easy to see these stars that are the siblings to your star in the sky by their spectra. So they long ago could have identified us in the sky. And then they would want to be here when we are at the point of being impressed to not go into the sky. But they can't predict exactly when that'll be. So they'll want to be here early, play it safe. So they should have been hanging around here for a long time, starting with their strategy of impressing us to domesticate us. So this would have gone a long way back. And of course, it could go long into the future. So obviously, the most important time to be playing this game is just before we might expand. But again, they can't be very sure when that is from home. So they might as well just be here early and repeat the whole process for a long time until we finally get it.
Yes, there are some people claim to have been abducted by aliens or visited by aliens. Like, do you just dismiss those evidence, or you can get very likely like something like that could have happened?
The whole point is here, we're trying to make guesses about aliens, right? Yeah. So aliens are almost by definition the sort of thing that's really hard to make guesses about. So I'm making a rough guess here, but I can't make very strong guesses about exactly how they plan to do things. Maybe in their mind, abductions are a way to, produce this domestication effect with a more direct, immediate contact. That's not a crazy thing they might try to do. It's not in my simplest story that they just have to hang out at the edge of visibility to impress us, but I can't be that confident about how sure they are in terms of spatial proximity. So, when we've domesticated dogs and cats and cows and horses, we were usually pretty physically close to them, right? We didn't do it from a hilltop a mile away, right? So it's not crazy that they might think they needed to be really close to make the domestication effect work. I don't know.
I want to switch gears a little bit towards prediction markets. So you are considered by many as the father of prediction markets, and you have written quite a lot, and you were very early on in prediction markets. You've recently started a new project. So I just wanted to know more about this. I think it's called Futarchy on blockchain. So can you share more about what it is?
So prediction markets are the idea of using betting markets to aggregate information to find out cost-effective estimates on questions you care about. And then I started that 35 years ago. And then 25 years ago, I started thinking about decision markets, i.e. prediction markets that were directly about the consequences of a decision, because that seemed to be most useful for advising decisions, and most of the value of information is to advise decisions. I wrote about that 25 years ago. I gave the name Futarchy to the version where you were running some sort of national or big grand government on the basis of decision markets. And for the last 25 years, there's been people who read about it and thought it was interesting, but haven't really tried it. In the last year or so, a number of groups have started to try it, which is heartening. Also means that, hey, if you want your idea to work, maybe you should just have to wait a long time. Have your ideas when you're young, put them out there and wait till the end of your life until maybe somebody will try things. So there was first a secretive India-based health agency, which has been trying it for roughly a year, but they aren't willing to go public with what they're doing. So I can't tell you much more about them. But then a little bit later, there was this crypto-based DAO, distributed autonomous organization called MetaDAO, and it has been using Futarchy for roughly a year. And they've had a lot of, basically, they let people make proposals for decisions that the organization might make. I think they've done 23 of those so far. And then they have a market in the value of their key token, conditional on adopting the proposal, and another market price for conditional on not adopting. And then the proposal is approved if the first price is higher than the second one consistently enough. And they've only rejected 6 of these 23 proposals so far. And so that's been a heartwarming success. And now they have some other clients of other crypto organizations that are also doing some decisions this way. And they're looking to move into evaluating grant proposals, because many of these crypto organizations have a budget for handing out grants, and they want to evaluate outcomes of grants as the way that they evaluate proposals. And so there's another startup that's moving into that space. And then there's a startup that I am chief scientist at, which is put the name Futarchy in its name of its organization. And it is hoping to do more in the governance end of the spectrum. And they have a contract with a particular crypto organization that's big and around for a long time called Gnosis to do governance markets for them. So now I'm excited that this idea is being tried out. And of course, the hope is that with success at small scale, you will move to other applications and more places would try the idea.
How can emerging economies use Futarchy or prediction markets? Like, how can they use it, and should they use it? Will they be advantages?
So, for example, this India-based health agency gave, they have hundreds of thousands of people in their district that they're responsible for giving health coverage to, medical coverage, and they gave them all an app on their phone that they could use to bet on these things. So it's not actually that expensive. It's not about, that. It's more about being willing to try it. So in general, what you need is some outcome measures you care about. So the India agency, they had infant mortality and a few other measures for their outcome measures. And then you need discrete choices you make, open on Saturday mornings or whatever it is for sites. And then you need to ask the market about the outcome measures conditional on the choices you might make. That's straightforward to do on electronic, sites, and it's not that expensive, and you just have to be willing to do it and to try it.
Right. Prediction markets are also in the spotlight in the US elections. It did quite well then exit polls. So how do you think prediction markets handle the US elections? And do you think this is a turning point where because of that, it will start picking up and really getting more popular?
Well, prediction markets have risen and fallen in popularity in the past. So actually about a century ago in the US, there was more money bet in US presidential betting markets than there was in the stock market at the time. So betting markets were very popular roughly a century ago in the United States. So clearly they've waned in popularity since then, but this is certainly an increase in temporary popularity at least. And I hope more activity will result from that. But I have to say that if you're asking the question of, what's more accurate, polls versus markets, et cetera, then you should just be looking at large data sets, and no one event should weigh that heavily on your mind. So here, yes, the markets did do better predicting Trump's win. And that's consistent with a much larger data set saying that on average they do better, but it's the large data sets that should really sway you, not one particular recent event.
You have written a book called Age of M, which is about uploading brain emulations and a future world where we'll have a digital version ourselves. So you wrote that, I think, back in 2018 or maybe earlier than that.
16.
16, sorry. So with the recent advance in large language models through Gen AI, like have your views changed in any manner when you wrote that book?
So the book Age of M was intended to be long-term futurism, not intended to be sensitive to short-term fluctuations in, technology or press releases or whatever. So I think it just isn't intended to be influenced by short-term changes. So if you thought we were almost ready to achieve human-level AI, then you might say, well, I guess that'll happen before brain emulations achieve human-level AI in machines, because brain emulations are still many decades off, as they were 16, plausibly even a century off. But AI also seemed to be a long way off. And then it was less clear which might happen first, but it seemed worth bothering to describe the scenario where brain emulations happen before human-level AI. Recently, we've had some exciting progress in AI. And if you thought that meant we were about to achieve human-level AI in the next 10 years, then yes, you'd say, well, I guess AI is going to get there first. But I don't think we're actually close. So I was an AI researcher long ago, from 84 to 93. And the history of AI has been, for 70 years at least, bursts of progress, which create excitement and interest in the area, and some people fearing we might already almost be there. And then, of course, that doesn't pan out, as we find that it's a lot harder than it looked. And we wait till the next burst of interest and excitement. And we've had those waves over and over again for a long time, and now we're in another one of those waves. And I got to say, the chance that this is the wave that finally puts us over the top is small. We're just going to keep having more waves after waves of progress until we finally succeed, but we're not almost there.
Got it. How do you think AI will affect status games and signaling? Do you think it will affect it? It won't affect it? What are your views on that?
Well, for most technology, the question is, do the people who have and use the technology gain how much status as a result? So certainly in the last half century or so, people who, say, have airplanes are higher status than people without airplanes, and people who had computers and cell phones were higher status than people who didn't, and people who use various technologies often gives them status for being the first to use the technology, being better able to use the technology, being more central in attention in the technology. So once upon a time, maybe opera singers were high status, but now it's movie stars and TV stars are high status because they are high status in the new technology era. So with AI, clearly there is a status contest going on to be at the frontier of AI. A lot of tech companies feel that a matter of pride's on the line, that they should put a lot of money in to try to be at least keeping up with everybody else in AI. So clearly among tech companies, AI is a mark of status. And that may be why we're sort of over-investing in AI now, because even though there's promising, we're putting enormous amounts of money in it. And my guess is that won't actually pan out. We will have put too much money in, but tech companies really can't stand not to be in the game. Otherwise they'd be admitting they're losers and, ignorant fools who don't get it and understand just how exciting it is and aren't able to do it. So that's status often is given in technology worlds to people who can master the latest, most impressive technologies. Later on, of course, when it becomes more immersed in our worlds, then there'll be status markers in terms of whether we use it. So for example, even in the last 10 years, there have been these various auditory assistants where you call out in the room, "Hey, Alexa, blah, blah." And, there's some status given to people who figured out how to integrate that in their lives, and they're just used to using that. And other people might seem backward because they haven't done it. Like me, I don't use those things. So that sort of status effect should presumably play out. In the future, there's the more interesting question whether the AI themselves will seem to be enough like us to be in the status game. That is, will we be competing with the AIs themselves for status? That's, of course, not something we've done in the past. Our technologies haven't been themselves status competing items. They've been things that we gain status by our association with, but that's still a long way off.
And so then, like, traditional signals like education, now considered a good signal, it will probably get lower in status with more AI.
It's not obvious. It might be that AI assisted education becomes all the more high status.
Yeah.
Depends on how well we learn, whether AI becomes competition for education or a complement to education. I mean, more likely a complement.
Right. And you mentioned like tech companies are over investing. So you think right now everyone is over investing in AI, and do you think it's a hype that will pass away?
The last big thing like this was the dot-com boom of the late 1990s, where people foresaw the internet as being a big thing and then invested enormously in internet-related businesses. And it was both true that that was overinvestment at the time, but it was also true the internet was going to be a big thing. The internet is now a big thing. It was clear that it was going to be a big thing. So it wasn't crazy for people to think it was going to be a big thing and to invest more in firms that seemed to have a better chance of being part of that world, but still they did overinvest in the dot-com boom in the internet. So that's an analogy. AI can still be a real good thing that'll happen in the next few decades. And it could be that some of these firms will have a leg up in that contest, but could it also be true that we're overinvesting?
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you think with AI we'll go towards a more homogeneous global culture where the variation between cultures reduce? We get more similar in our tastes and values.
I think we are moving to a global monoculture and have been for a while. I don't see AI as having that much to do with it.
Okay.
I mean, when AI becomes a much bigger deal, it'll have more effects on the society and economy, but it's hard to foresee that now. But even setting that aside, we are, in fact, becoming a much stronger global monoculture, and that has a lot of important implications.
So, like, how do you view that and culture drift? On one hand, you are mentioning that culture is drifting, but on the other hand, there is this homogeneous culture. So how do you view those 2 points together?
I guess let just be clear on what concepts I'm trying to say here. I'd say, humans have always been strongly influenced by culture. It's our human superpower. And it's what lets us change and evolve much faster than all the other animals and do all the spectacular things we do. But culture has two levels. So an analogy is species, biological species. There's two kinds of evolution in species. There's evolution within a species of the things that can vary within a species. And then there's evolution of the species of the things that are constant within a species. And it turns out that evolution of species seems to actually matter more than evolution within species, even though it's maybe because it's harder to evolve the things that are common within a species that can't be varied within a species. So those things get stuck more, and then it matters more that you can get those unstuck. So analogy in culture, there are the things that we can vary within a culture, like much of our technology. And then there's the things that we can't vary very easily within a culture, so that in order to have evolution of that, we need to have a lot of different cultures. So given that distinction, I'd say the key thing that's happened in the last few centuries is we went from a world of hundreds of thousands of diverse peasant cultures, each of which was pretty well adapted because it was near the edge of survival in terms of famine and war and disease and, et cetera. And now over the last centuries, what we did is we crushed peasant cultures into national cultures, and then we merged national cultures into a global monoculture, and we've greatly reduced the selection pressures on these cultures. That is, they just die off much less due to famine and disease and war. And the natural effect you expect from this is that they are no longer as disciplined by selection. And so if they have a substantial rate of internal change, which they do and has increased actually, then they will be drifting away from what was adaptive to maladaptation. That's the theoretical expectation you should have once you realize that we had hundreds of thousands of cultures that were very well adapted because they had strong threats of these things going wrong. And now we have very few cultures that are very rich and comfortable and healthy and peaceful. And so there's just much less selection pressure. And so the prediction is they're slowly drifting into maladaptation. And I think that's my best way to summarize why fertility is declining, is because that's a drift that isn't being fixed by selection pressures. And there's many other ways in which, our cultures are drifting. So the key problem again is not enough variation, not enough selection pressure, and too much internal drift. So these old peasant cultures from centuries ago, they were pretty conservative. They didn't like to change very many things. But in the last century or so, we've come to celebrate and make the most prestigious among us cultural activists who are purposely trying to change our culture. And, so we have all these different cultural activists pushing and fighting in different directions for different ways to change culture. Some of them win and some lose, and then our culture changes. But that whole process doesn't seem to be disciplined by selection. It just seems to be internally driven by these activist fights. And so that's also a way in which, culture is just not changing without being disciplined by selection pressures. And in addition, I think there are some ways in which there are sort of natural tendencies of human culture that are bad, that selection was restraining and stopping before. And now the lack of selection means we're drifting in those predictable and maladaptive directions.
So, what will be the consequences of that? Like, you mentioned fertility decline as a consequence of this, but what do you think are some other consequences of this maladaptive pressures?
Well, basically, adaptive cultures are ones that can reproduce and grow and survive threats like disease and famine and war. And maladaptive cultures don't. They are worse at dealing with those things. So the consequence of drifting into maladaptation is that we won't survive as many such things. Not only won't we grow and reproduce, but we will be more fragile and easily threatened by war and disease and when they finally come. So not everyone is in a global monoculture. We do have some strikingly insular fertile subcultures like the Haredim or the Amish and some others. They are still small at the moment, but they seem to be more adaptive. That is, they are growing rapidly, say doubling every 20 years, while the rest of the world's in decline. So plausibly, the most plausible scenario in the long run is they just win. Our global monoculture just slowly fades and gets replaced by these fast-growing, alternative, again, insular, fertile, heavily religious subcultures. So that's the most straightforward consequence is we just go away. So an analogy was the Christians taking over the Roman Empire. Basically, they doubled every 20 years for 3 centuries, and that allowed them to go from, 1,000 people to being the majority of the Roman Empire. And then when they finally took over the Roman Empire had lost many things by that point because of its reduction in scale. And then they threw away many other things they didn't like. Christians didn't like everything about the Roman Empire. And then eventually, there was a dark ages and then a rise again. So the prediction is that our great, spectacular global monoculture will decline for centuries and then be replaced by these others. And then maybe it takes centuries more before a new civilization rises to our heights again.
Got it. Do you think fertility decline is no longer an important neglected problem? Because
it's definitely neglected in the sense that we aren't fixing it. More people are talking about it, but talking about it does not fix the problem.
Yeah, a lot more, Elon Musk tweets about it, and there's a lot more talk that goes on about it. And
so in the Roman Empire, they knew they had a fertility problem. They knew they had a decline. The same thing happened in the Greek Empire 300 years before. They knew they had a fertility problem. Many past civilizations, again, have seen that they had a fertility problem, tried to do big things to fix it, and failed. So the Roman Emperor Augustus tried to implement a lot of pretty strong policies to promote fertility. They basically failed. And many other civilizations have also failed at this. Like the first part of Europe to have a fertility decline was France. They were once like half of all of Europe. They dominated Europe, but with their being the first with fertility decline, they became in a small declining fraction of Europe and eventually lost world wars.
But they're still 1 billion, 2 billion people who if you just look at the Western culture, don't you think that's a lot?
Well, there's lots of people in the world. So look, if you thought maybe there's too many people and we should shrink the population down to some ideal level, maybe, 500 million, what you'd want is a process that was sensitive to the number, right? It was going to decline until it got to the right number and then it was going to stop declining. But the social processes by which fertility are declining are just not sensitive to a number like that. They're not going to stop at a particular number when you think that's the right number. So you have to worry that they will just keep going. you have to ask, do you have any lever on these processes by which you could change the rate? Because otherwise it'll just keep going down and down and down. It'll take many centuries for that to happen. But when it reaches whatever you think the right level is, what is it you think will stop the decline and suddenly make it revive? Because again, in the past, we haven't seen that. That is, we've seen declines in fertility and population, and we've seen leaders say, okay, this is too far, we need to stop, and they fail to stop it. So maybe if you have the button that works, you could wait to push the button until later on when you think we've reached the right level, but I don't think you have a button.
That makes sense. Like your colleague Tyler Cowen, he writes a lot about AI, nuclear risk. He doesn't seem as interested on the topics of fertility and culture decline. You see that AI and nuclear risk is more important. Like maybe he sees it as more important. Do you have any views on that?
So if you ask me what I think about AI versus fertility, I will say that AI is, overhyped at the moment. It's going to be important, but it's, going to slow down just like all the other ones have, and then we'll have new things later. And if I say fertility is going to continue to decline, and it's just a serious problem that we don't have any good handle on how to reverse. If you ask me, well, why aren't other people like my colleague Tyler talking more about fertility rather than AI? Well, it's because people love to talk about what everybody else is talking about. That's part of how our culture goes. That is, key way the cultural evolution works is that people want to be seen as high status, and they want to be doing and seeming to be the things that everybody else who's high status is. And that's part of the way things go wrong, is this process by which we decide what high status is not really conscious or driven by adaptation. It's just a random way in which whoever is high status now gets to tell us what's high status. We believe them. And now the high status people are saying AI is high status. So it doesn't really matter if my analysis is to say it's going to peak. If you're eager for status, you talk about what all the other high status people are talking about. That's how it works. You don't get credit. If you know that a current fad is going to peak and decline and you avoid the fad and you talk about other stuff, you don't get credit for that later. All anybody knows is no one was listening to you for a while, so you can't be very important, right? So in order to seem important, you have to be talking about what everybody else is talking about and getting them to listen to you. So whatever they're talking about, you have to talk about regardless of how important you think it is.
Well, that makes sense. Probably like prediction markets, maybe 25 years later, people will be talking maybe about it.
Right, but I won't get any credit for talking about it earlier than other people. I mean, basically, the people who get the most credit for talking about a subject are the ones who talk about it exactly when it's popular to talk about it. People that talk about it later or earlier don't get credit. They say, well, you look at you, obviously you don't get when to talk about things. You were talking about it at the wrong time.
Right. Do you think awareness of signaling and status games affects our abilities? Do you think knowing that people are signaling, or knowing that we are going to signal, or knowing about status game, does all this lead how we ourselves act or behave? Do we become better at it?
You're referring, I think, to ideas to describe in my book, The Elephant in the Brain, which I'm showing here on the screen.
Yes.
Evolution created our tendency to care about status, to care about signaling, and to be unaware of it. Its bet was that we were better off being hypocritical and ignorant of these things than being consciously aware. So unless it was wrong about you, the world has changed in important ways such that evolution's guesses about your world and your strategy were wrong, you are probably better off not knowing explicitly about signaling and status because you were designed not to know. So go with how you were designed. But there are some of us whose job it is to try to understand the world and to try to, figure out what's really going on. And so for us, it might be our job to be slightly less effective in our personal lives in order to figure out what's really going on. And so if you think that's your job too, then maybe you should learn more about signaling and status, even though the simple theory predicts that, that'll be a hindrance to you in trying to be successful.
Do you think it's common across cultures and countries? Do you think even, let's say, in India or in other cultures, we see the same hidden motives?
We all have many hidden motives. They aren't the same mix at the same strength in every culture. That's part of how cultures differ. But I think pretty much all cultures have a pretty high weight on status. there are many what we call egalitarian cultures where it's not okay to flaunt your status and to brag about your status. But even in those egalitarian cultures, people do in fact vary by status, and they do work hard to try to be seen as higher status, even if they're not allowed to say so.
Got it. And I want to bring in AI again with your ideas in the book. So let's say I want to make a decision, I run it past an AI or I consult it. Do you think it will lead to like a reduction in biases in signaling, or do you think we'll still have these same biases?
So the modern AI are these language models that are trained on large sets of data. They have two versions. There's the raw version that just maximizes its predictive power of the next token in the text sequence. And that is then going to embody exactly all the biases of the text it was trained on. And then we often have a finishing school, way we modify that by training them on certain ways we want them to act and to be, polite and social and et cetera. And then that training process then changes the biases to be whatever the biases the training process wants. So that's usually not exactly to be accuracy. There's quite a lot of evidence that in fact they make them less accurate to make them more socially acceptable in order to be, well-trained large language model. So you're not avoiding human biases here. First, you're just getting the average of all human biases in the initial training, and then you are producing the biases of whatever company is trying to make and sell this AI for its customers.
I want to ask you, how do you personally manage your own biases? You've written so much about it, you're aware of it. Do you have like a system that you implement to manage your own biases?
I think many people try to sort of collect a list of, standard biases and sort of train themselves in the habit of, say, using Bayes' rule for things. And that all really mostly works for situations where your inclination to be biased is pretty weak and the inclination to be biased is pretty strong. That doesn't do that much because basically you already knew a lot of that stuff. You were being biased not because you didn't know how not to be, it's because you wanted to be biased. And so the main way you can change that is to change the incentives you're in. That is, put yourself around people who are likely to criticize you and to call you bullshit. Then you will be more careful about bullshit. Put yourself in a situation where you'll get a lot of feedback from the world about what works, or even, get in the habit of making bets because bets will, produce incentives tied to reality, and that pushes you to be more careful. The main ways you can be less biased is to put yourself in a context where biases are punished.
You have mentioned about cryonics. It's where you freeze your brain for future advanced civilizations to come rescue. So there is like skepticism around that idea. So why are you in particular convinced that it's going to work or it may work?
I think a lot of the skepticism about cryonics is just that it's nonconformist, and people are very reluctant to look nonconformist. They're basically the reasonable skepticism about cryonics is that, the process wouldn't work. What's the process? First, the process is freezing you, and so some damage happens in freezing. Secondly, there's the risk that they won't preserve you. That is, the organization won't last, or they'll somehow fail in keeping you frozen. And then third, there's the risk that there won't be a world to come back to that's advanced and capable of reviving you. So I think the middle skepticism is the strongest one, i.e. that the organization just won't last. But then I think you have to just do a cost-benefit calculation saying, well, what's the chance of it working that would be enough to make it worth the bother? And I've done a rough estimate that I think, 5% chance justifies taking the effort. So I don't need to be at all very confident that it's going to work. I basically need to think there's at least a 5% chance. So I think it's more likely than not that freezing preserves the key information in your brain that, is who you are. There's a chance it's not, but I think more likely than not, it does, in fact. And then as we get better at freezing, it'll be even more true that they're saving the right information. So past freezing technologies have been worse at the amount of damage that happens. And then if they serve the right information, then what they need is for the storage to work and then for the future to be very advanced. So I guess some people are skeptical the future will be very advanced, capable of doing a lot more things that we can do today. That's a common observation, but I think that's relatively unlikely. The future will probably be much more advanced than us, compared just like we are much more advanced than our past. But in fact, as I've become more concerned about cultural drift in the last year or so, I am now more concerned about the storage problem. If I thought civilization wasn't going to collapse, then I just have to think that the cryonics organizations have to last maybe a century or so until our descendant civilization becomes just so much more capable than we are that they are capable of doing the revival. But once I think that we have a decline of several centuries and then more centuries for revive again, well, now there's a deadline. Unless we can actually revive a cryonics patient in the next roughly 70 years worth of progress, we have to wait many centuries. And then it is a much bigger ask for these organizations to last that long. And that's why I would rather they did what's called fixation, where they basically infuse the brain with a lot of chemicals that bind to things and just hold it all in place with plastic, basically, such that you could store it at room temperature in a permafrost or something for many centuries, and then you'd have a shot at coming back. Unfortunately, most of the customers of cryonics are more focused on a scenario where their body itself will be regenerated, and therefore they want to store at very low temperatures, which they think makes that more likely. But requiring an organization to store you for many centuries at low temperatures is just a pretty big ask, I'm afraid.
So what do you think is more likely to happen? Do you think through cryonics anyone can be restored, or do you think AGI will come first, or do you think aliens will visit us first, or do you think like cultural decline will mess this all up?
Well, if aliens are here now, then they've already reached that milestone, right? But if aliens are not here now, it's, I would estimate 1 billion years before we'll see them. So that's not on the table. That's one of the race things here. I think cryonic revival is a pretty ambitious technology, and that's correlated with MEMS brain emulations being feasible. So I think if we manage to produce brain emulations before civilization declines, we probably also would manage to make cryonics work by then. I say give you roughly 50-50. I'm not so sure which happens first, AI or brain emulations. But my guess is that neither of them happen before civilization declines, so that we have to wait until a new civilization rises again to do those things.
So what do you think will happen in the next few centuries of the human civilization? Do you think it's just about culture decline, or what's going to happen?
Technology will continue to improve, but unless it achieves human level AI through, AGI or through brain emulations, then the decline in the number of humans will be devastating for the economy, and that technology will just no longer be feasible and be lost for a while. And then we will slowly have a decline in the number of people and the level of our civilization over centuries, until, again, my default is that we get replaced by the Amish and Haredim, who then grow but also reject a lot of our technology, and requiring their descendants centuries later to rediscover and reinvent it.
And how do you think religion will evolve in view of these technological changes?
The winners here, the Amish and Haredim, are quite religious. So our mainland civilization, the religion has been greatly declining in that. And, if that was a future religion, it looks pretty dim for religion. But if in fact the main civilizations likely to replace us are very religious, then I think religion has a strong future.
Is there anything that you have recently changed your mind about?
Well, certainly, again, I just said, until recently, I had been expecting our continued growth of our civilization at roughly the same rate we've seen for the last century or so. And now I've changed my mind to see a decline as more likely. That's a pretty big change. And I have recently realized that culture is a lot more important than I had seen it as before, and pretty overwhelmingly important. And to sort of see the basic process by which culture change as much less intelligent or sophisticated than I might have guessed. It's actually pretty simple and random. And so that's a pretty stark vision to see.
What do you think we can do about it? I think you mentioned to incentivize people to have more children through economic incentives.
Well, we could cure or fix fertility decline if we chose to do so in very specific, understandable ways, but that would in fact change culture in big ways. And The question is, are we willing to? So I think many people would correctly see those sorts of changes as undermining the kind of cultural changes that they were wanting to celebrate and push. Question is whether we can overcome that reluctance. Basically, obviously, if we had a better culture, it would do the right things to avoid these problems, but you can't just wish that. So I've been thinking a lot about different solution scenarios. So in some sense, one solution scenario is we do develop human level AI and we leave it free enough to evolve its own culture, because then it would face Malthusian strong selection pressures, because they would be their population can increase quickly, driving their wages down to subsistence levels. So AIs would in fact revive strong cultural selection pressures. But that's only if we let the AIs be free enough to do so. Many people are concerned about AI risk, and their solution is to basically enslave the AIs and ensure that they can't be free of our culture, in which case they are not a solution. And again, just developing human level AI is quite a challenge, and we may not, my guess is we won't do it by the deadline. Another approach that is kind of a long shot that I'm intrigued by is the idea that we could together agree on some long-term sacred goal, like the date we get to the stars, and tie that goal to a governance mechanism like Futarchy. Because, if such a goal was in conflict with civilization collapse, then the governance mechanism would figure out how to do what it takes to prevent collapse. And then as it was demanding sacrifices of it that we didn't like that much, if we knew that it was in the service of a sacred goal we had all agreed to, we might be proud to make those sacrifices rather than irritated and allow them to go through. But you can see this is a pretty big ask. We'd have to choose such a sacred goal, feel committed to it. It would have to be a goal in conflict with civilization collapse. And we'd have to have a governance mechanism that was effective at promoting it, like Futarchy, and we'd have to adopt it. So a lot of long shots there in that scenario. So I have to guess that it won't happen, but that's at least an intriguing solution.
A final question is, there's a lot of talk about on regulation on AI. Do you think we should ease up on the regulation so that one of the solutions maybe can get implemented of reaching AI level, having their own cultures, or should we ease up on the regulations?
In general, in the history of regulation, regulation goes best when it's responding to concrete, specific, realized problems, like automobile accidents, and trying to reduce those problems. Regulation goes quite badly when we are responding to some abstract concern that hasn't been very concretely realized. And so we're trying to sort of abstractly constrain a whole space of things we don't understand. So that's happened, I think, in nuclear power and in genetic engineering. And so, unfortunately, if we respond to AI at the moment using abstract concerns about things that are far from happening now, we'll just screw that up. So I would rather we wait until we see concrete things going wrong with AI and then respond to those with regulation as needed. But at the moment, almost nothing's gone wrong. AIs aren't hurting anybody. They're not causing damage in the world. They're just basically fancy search engines or conversation tools. Almost no harm is happening there. So there's almost no need for regulation of the actual observed behavior so far. All the call for regulation is about imagined future scenarios over which we have pretty poor handle. We don't really have much of an idea what these future scenarios would be like that are going to cause the problems we might worry about. And so responding to that with concrete regulations now is pretty damaging.
Thank you so much, Professor, for joining. It was a pleasure having you